We all remember what Fortress Europe was supposed to mean: an impenetrable defense, a guaranteed line Hitler's enemies could not cross. But the men who flew those B-17s in 1943 know the chilling truth. It wasn't a fortress built of steel, but of arithmetic. For a long, brutal stretch of that war, the German High Command had the numbers on their side, not because their planes were unbeatable, but because our own fighters simply couldn't carry enough fuel. Imagine being a bomber pilot, watching your escort peel away at that imaginary line over the continent, knowing that in minutes you would be alone in a sky swarming with hungry Messerschmitts. That vulnerability, that fatal 500-mile gap, was Hitler's entire strategic defense strategy. This story is not about a new plane, it's about a single engineering secret, an engine swap that broke the German arithmetic and brought the war right to the enemy's doorstep. We were told that the Reich, from the coasts of France deep into the German industrial heartland, was an impenetrable fortress, and for a long, terrible period in 1943, that belief felt entirely justified. The simple fact that no American fighter could go the distance. Before the P-51 Mustang arrived, American air doctrine held a stubborn conviction that their heavy bombers, the formidable B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, were self-defending. With their bristling turrets and dozens of .50 caliber machine guns, they were supposed to fly in tight formation, the famed combat box, and carve their way to the target and back. History suggests this strategy was a costly delusion. The Luftwaffe was simply too numerous, too aggressive, and too well-positioned. The standard USF fighter in 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt or the P-38 Lightning, could only accompany the bombers for about 400 to 500 miles round trip from England. That covered the coast and western France, an area Hitler was perfectly willing to sacrifice. But the critical industrial targets, the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, the assembly lines in Regensburg, or the oil refineries deep in the Ruhr, were far beyond that distance. This meant that at a predetermined point over the continent, the bomber crews had to watch their escorts execute a lonely turn back toward England. It was a moment of profound psychological tension, because they knew what came next. The German fighters, conserving their fuel and waiting in the high-altitude haze, were just beginning their shift. During the disastrous missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg in the summer and fall of 1943, the USAAF sustained catastrophic losses. On the second Schweinfurt raid alone, in October, they lost 60 B-17s shot down and another 17 written off due to damage, totaling 82 heavy bombers lost out of 291 dispatched. That's a loss rate of over 28%. History confirms that any military unit sustaining losses over 10% is considered functionally crippled. At 28%, the Daylight strategic bombing campaign was nearly suicidal. The missions were temporarily suspended, and the idea of Fortress Europe was for a moment reality. Therefore, the Luftwaffe had settled into a comfortable routine. They would allow the P-47s to burn up their fuel near the coast, and once those escorts peeled off, the waiting Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs would tear into the unescorted bomber streams. The belief in Hitler's high command was simple. The enemy cannot reach our factories and return home intact. This was their critical strategic flaw. But while the Allied airmen were licking their wounds, a radical engineering change was brewing, one that started with a transatlantic loan and an engine swap. The British, who had initially ordered the North American Mustang, the P-51, for low-altitude work with its original Allison engine, were deeply impressed with the airframe's laminar flow wing design. The Mustang was incredibly aerodynamic, but its Allison engine was a dog above 15,000 feet, where the bombers flew. The revolutionary idea came from Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker and was championed by the visionary U.S. Air Attaché, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas J. Hitchcock, Jr. Hitchcock, a World War I flying ace himself, understood the need for high altitude. The purple payoff here is the ingenious pairing. They decided to take the sleek American-designed P-51 airframe and fit it with the heart of British air superiority, the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61. This Merlin was a masterpiece of wartime engineering, but its core feature was the two-stage, two-speed supercharger. It wasn't just a bigger fan, it was a sophisticated mechanical air pump that could compress the thin air at 30,000 feet and force it into the cylinders, effectively making the engine think it was flying at sea level. The initial trials of the Mustang Mark X, the British designation for the conversion, showed a speed jump of over 100 miles per hour at high altitude compared to its Allison predecessor. That's not a modification, that's a rebirth. The license-built version, manufactured in America by the Packard Motor Car Company as the V1650, gave the P-51 the power it needed. But it was the Mustang's original massive fuel capacity and the brilliant addition of jettisonable drop tanks, carrying up to 75 gallons each, that truly unlocked its potential. This combination meant the P-51B and P-51C models could now fly an operational radius of over 1,000 miles, providing escort all the way to Berlin and back. The Mirage of Fortress Europe, Hitler's belief that his bombers would be safe beyond the range of our fighters, was shattered by the reality of a new war machine. The P-51 didn't just accompany the bombers, it went all the way to the heart of the Reich, forcing the desperate Luftwaffe to fight on Allied terms. It was no longer a question of whether the bombers would be protected, but whether the German pilots could even survive the encounter. This single fact, this 2,000-mile ferry range, became the fulcrum upon which the entire air war turned, and therefore the next phase of the script must examine the immediate devastating consequences this new escort had on the enemy fighter arm, which history records as the Big Week. The strategic mindset of the German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, was not rooted in incompetence, it was built on a series of historical victories and a profound misunderstanding of mass production capability. They operated under a logic that on paper appeared unbeatable. The point here is understanding why Hitler and Göring were so confident in their air defense doctrine, even as Allied losses mounted. Their entire strategy hinged on the concept of defense in depth and a simple calculation of economics. They believed the Allies could not sustain the cost of unescorted daylight bombing. The German system for defending the fatherland was designed like an onion with layers of flak batteries, early warning radar, and, crucially, localized fighter Geschwader, wings. The logic was, let the enemy bombers fly deep where they are fatigued and low on fuel, and then attack them close to their target. They knew the P-47s and P-38s would eventually have to turn back. Their fighters, the famed Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, were heavier, carried more cannon armament, and were fueled from local airfields, giving them a decisive energy advantage right where the bombers were most vulnerable, over the target area. This created a kill zone over the industrial Ruhr and Berlin. The German pilots didn't need range, they needed overwhelming local superiority. The purple payoff of this strategy was the initial devastation of the U.S. 8th Air Force. The OKW believed they were bleeding the Allies dry, mission by mission. General Adolf Galland, one of the most brilliant German fighter aces, stated that the constant attrition of the American bomber force would make the campaign politically unsustainable for the Allies before it became militarily impossible for the Luftwaffe to defend. But their logic contained two fatal flaws, and they both stemmed from underestimating American and British industrial capacity, especially when it came to a simple accessory: the external fuel tank. The first flaw was their reliance on heavy, cannon-armed interceptors. The FW-190 in particular was a devastating weapon. It was fast, rugged, and carried heavy 20mm or 30mm cannons. The German idea was not to dogfight the bombers, but to break the combat box formation with a single massive pass. These were designed as bomber killers.
The consequence was that these planes were relatively heavy, and their engine and fuel capacity were optimized for short, high-speed interception sorties, not long-duration patrols. This meant their pilots were also mentally and physically limited to short, high-intensity bursts of combat. Therefore, the moment the P-51 arrived, the entire operational calculus was inverted. The P-51, with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was not only faster than the German interceptors at high altitude, but had a far superior climb rate and, most importantly, could loiter for hours. The new escort fighter was a hunter, built for endurance. This leads to the second, more profound flaw in the OKW's logic. They failed to adapt their aircraft production. While the U.S. focused on the P-51's single-type mass production, the German industry, swayed by political infighting and an over-reliance on technological miracles, fragmented its production. They poured resources into an array of complex specialist aircraft, heavy interceptors, rocket fighters like the Me-163 Comet, and, eventually, jet fighters like the Me-262. Consider this. In 1944, the year the Mustang achieved air superiority, German aircraft production reached its highest monthly peak. Yet, much of that production was squandered on types that required specialized fuel, highly trained pilots, which they were running out of, and were ill-suited for the long-range escort paddle. History suggests that a centralized focus on one superior piston-engine fighter, like the late-model FW-190, might have stemmed the tide. Instead, they scattered their effort, relying on technical complexity to win the day. But the simplest innovation, the jettisonable drop tank, was the true strategic difference. The German High Command saw the war as a finite resource battle. They knew an aircraft had a limited range. The P-51's tanks were essentially inexpensive disposable aluminum or papier-mâché cylinders. Once the fuel was burned and the drop tanks were jettisoned over enemy territory, the fighter became light, fast, and ready for combat. This simple piece of gear gave the Mustangs the ability to carry a combat payload of fuel right up to the doorstep of the German factories. This wasn't just a physical shift, it was a psychological one. Before 1944, German pilots knew exactly where their enemies would retreat. After 1944, with the Mustangs flying deep penetration, the German air bases themselves were no longer sanctuaries. The Mustangs would patrol overhead, waiting for the German interceptors to land, effectively locking them out of their own airfields. The pilots who did manage to damage a B-17 now had to worry about a highly aggressive P-51 following them all the way home. The concept of Fortress Europe was premised on a geographical safety zone. The P-51, powered by the Merlin, annihilated that zone, turning the sky over Berlin from a defensive screen into a contested battlefield. The long-range escort didn't just protect the bombers, it forced the decisive engagement on the Germans' most critical resource, their experienced fighter pilots. Therefore, the next part of this story must detail the specific engineering marvel that allowed the P-51 to fly faster and higher than the Germans thought possible, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine itself. If the P-51 Mustang was the sword that struck the heart of the Reich, then the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was the forge that created it. This isn't just a story about horsepower, it's a fascinating look at how desperation coupled with a stroke of genius can redefine the rules of war. Why the initial P-51, the American-designed airframe, was a disappointment, and how an engine meant for a completely different plane, the Spitfire, became the solution to the Allied bomber crisis. When North American Aviation first designed the Mustang for the British, they equipped it with the Allison V1710 engine. The Allison was a perfectly serviceable, powerful engine at low altitudes, which is what the British needed for ground attack and reconnaissance. It performed beautifully up to about 15,000 feet. The airframe itself was a revelation. Its laminar flow wing was aerodynamically slicker than anything else flying, giving it incredible speed and efficiency. But the moment the Mustang climbed above that 15,000-foot ceiling, it hit a wall. Its performance dropped off so dramatically it was nearly useless as a high-altitude escort. And as we know, the bomber war took place between 25,000 and 30,000 feet. The German fighters, like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190, were optimized for this high-altitude fight where the air is thin and raw power is the only thing that matters. The original Mustang simply couldn't keep up, nor could it climb fast enough to challenge the Germans who were attacking from above. It was a beautiful fuselage with an asthmatic heart. The solution was not to redesign the airframe, but to swap its soul. And this is where the story of transatlantic collaboration and one of the greatest engines in history begins. The British had already perfected the art of high-altitude piston power with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. While the Allison used a single-stage supercharger, essentially a basic fan to compress air, the Merlin 60 series, introduced in the Mark IX Spitfire, employed a groundbreaking two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Think of a supercharger as the engine's lungs. At high altitude, the air is so thin that a normal engine is starved of oxygen, causing power output to drop rapidly. The Merlin's two-stage system solved this by creating two massive gulps of air compression. The first stage takes the thin air and compresses it significantly, and the second stage compresses it even more, pushing the equivalent of sea-level air density into the engine's cylinders even at over 30,000 feet. But pure compression generates massive heat. Hot air is less dense and therefore provides less power. Rolls-Royce countered this with another critical component, the intercooler. This heat exchanger cooled the highly compressed air between the first and second stages of the supercharger, maximizing the oxygen content and allowing the engine to produce phenomenal power without overheating or detonating its fuel prematurely. When this engine, the Merlin 61 or 66, designated as the Packard V1650 when license-built in the U.S., was bolted onto the P-51 airframe, the results were transformational. The purple payoff statistics are shocking. The altitude performance gap closed instantly. Suddenly, the Mustang could not only match the German fighters at 30,000 feet, but outperform them. At its critical altitude, the Mustang gained over 100 miles per hour in top speed compared to the Allison version. It was a beautiful fuselage with an asthmatic heart. The solution was not to redesign the airframe, but to swap its soul. And this is where the story of transatlantic collaboration and one of the greatest engines in history begins. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine granted the P-51 its unparalleled range. This technological shift we've discussed, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine granting the P-51 its unparalleled range, was not merely a footnote in military history, it was the mechanism that drove the decisive engagements of the air war. This stage of the conflict, dubbed deep penetration, wasn't just about reaching the target, it was about forcing the Luftwaffe to fight a war of attrition over their own homeland, a battle they simply were not prepared to win.
The Allies realized that as long as the German fighters were in the sky, no factory was permanently disabled. The goal became air superiority, purchased with the blood of the Luftwaffe pilots. This forced confrontation began in earnest with a concerted effort known to the Allies as the Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944. This was the first time the newly available P-51s, now flying with drop tanks, were sent en masse to escort bombers deep into Germany. The target was the German aircraft industry, specifically the final assembly plants for fighters. The German High Command was initially incredulous. They simply did not believe the reports. They had calculated the maximum range of the Allied fighters. They had done the arithmetic. But the Mustangs were suddenly over Braunschweig, over Leipzig, over Regensburg, places they had previously considered safe havens. The purple payoff of this strategic maneuver was the sheer audacity of the attack. Over a period of 7 days, the 8th and 15th Air Forces dispatched nearly 3,400 bomber sorties, escorted by over 2,000 fighter sorties, deep into the Reich. This was an overwhelming commitment. The German response was frantic and fatalistic. They were forced to commit their remaining veteran pilots and their best remaining aircraft, previously reserved for local defense, into a decisive fight far from their bases. Before the P-51, the German pilots could pick their targets, attack, and disengage back into friendly airspace while the Allied fighters ran out of fuel. Now the Mustangs were waiting for them. The battle over Berlin and the Ruhr became a protracted, high-altitude dogfight, a chess game where the Mustangs consistently held the initiative. The P-51 pilots were trained to be aggressive hunters. Their primary directive was not just to protect the bombers, but to destroy the enemy fighters. We have specific accounts from both sides that show the devastating effectiveness of this doctrine. For the American pilots, the mission became an air combat patrol, flying ahead and above the bomber streams to clear the airspace. They would deliberately engage the German climbing formations, using the superior speed and climb of the Merlin engine to their advantage. The purple payoff in terms of pilot loss ratio is stark. During the Big Week, the Allies lost 244 heavy bombers, a horrific toll, but the Luftwaffe lost over 350 fighters and, critically, lost even more of their irreplaceable seasoned pilots. The concept of deep penetration was about turning the enemy's geography against them. When a German pilot had to bail out over the Ruhr, he was back in the cockpit tomorrow. When a P-51 pilot bailed out over France, he was likely captured. But when a German pilot, having been pursued and bested by a Mustang, had to bail out over the forests near Berlin, he was lost. The loss of the aircraft could be mitigated by the German factories, but the loss of the pilot, trained over years, was an unrecoverable blow. This was the psychological element of the fight. The key strategic goal of deep penetration was not the factories below, but the pilots above. The air superiority war shifted from a war of materiel to a war of manpower. The Mustangs were acting as a massive airborne vacuum cleaner, sucking the life out of the Luftwaffe fighter arm. The psychological toll on the German side was immediate and profound. Imagine being a German pilot, scrambled from your base, knowing that you have a 30-minute window before you run low on fuel, and now facing an enemy that seems to have unlimited range. Before, the bomber box was a challenge. Now it was a deadly trap, covered by highly aggressive, long-legged escorts. In the skies over Berlin, the Mustangs were a terror. The German fighters, especially the faster, heavier FW-190s, were excellent at making fast, high-energy attacks on the bombers, but the Mustang could stick with them, dogfight them, and chase them far from the formation. The most feared tactic became the follow-through chase, where a Mustang pilot, seeing a German fighter break away after an attack run, would pursue them all the way to their home airfield, forcing them to land under fire or crash. This relentless pressure led directly to a major strategic failure in German command, the decision to prioritize home defense over the Eastern Front. By late 1944, the majority of the Luftwaffe fighter squadrons were permanently tied up defending the Reich, leaving the German armies battling the Soviets on the Eastern Front virtually exposed to Allied air attack. This contributed directly to the Soviet ability to achieve tactical dominance on the ground. Hitler's need to protect his factories from the bombers meant his armies in the field were losing the war. But the battle wasn't just a cakewalk for the Mustangs. The German pilots, though losing their numerical and tactical advantage, were skilled and fighting for their homes. They introduced new tactics, such as the use of Sturmgruppen, squadrons of heavily armored, cannon-laden FW-190s designed to fly in tight formation and absorb punishment while closing to point-blank range on the B-17s. These were dangerous units, and the Mustangs had to adapt to fighting these flying tanks. The long-range escort fighter had achieved its strategic goal by the summer of 1944. General Carl Spaatz, the commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces, confirmed the victory. The fighter arm of the Luftwaffe had been systematically destroyed. The losses in pilot hours were catastrophic. The average time a new German pilot survived over the Reich plummeted to weeks, sometimes days, while the Allied fighter pilots were flying multiple, long-duration missions, gaining experience with every flight. The longest day's battle, the sustained period of deep penetration that began with the Big Week and lasted through D-Day, achieved air superiority not just locally, but strategically. When the Allied invasion began on June 6, 1944, the skies over the landing beaches were virtually empty of German fighters. Hitler's Air Force, which had been reserved to repel the invasion, had already been destroyed 30,000 feet over the Ruhr. The P-51 didn't just win a series of dogfights, it won the prerequisite battle for the entire European campaign. Therefore, the result of this air victory was the collapse of the Luftwaffe's morale and combat readiness, which fundamentally altered the psychology of the conflict, both in the air and on the ground.
The physical destruction of the Luftwaffe fighter arm during the deep penetration campaign was catastrophic. But the true measure of the P-51's success lay in the devastating psychological toll it exacted. This was a war won not just with cannons and engines, but through the systematic erosion of pilot confidence, doctrine, and institutional morale. For a fighter force, nothing is more corrosive than the constant grinding realization that the enemy always holds the initiative and possesses a seemingly inexhaustible supply of resources. Before the Mustangs arrived, a German pilot could fly an interception knowing he was defending the Reich in an area where his superior firepower and local fuel supply gave him the edge. Once the Allied fighters turned back, the airspace was his domain. That safety blanket was violently ripped away in early 1944. The American escorts were no longer just a hurdle, they were a 2,000-mile threat. In 1943, the average Luftwaffe pilot had logged hundreds of hours and often possessed multiple aerial victories, having honed his skills on the Eastern Front or during the Battle of Britain. By late 1944, the training pipeline had been shattered by the relentless destruction of training facilities and the diversion of fuel. New pilots were rushed through minimal training, often less than 200 hours of total flying time, compared to the 400-plus hours logged by an Allied pilot, and thrown into combat against seasoned veterans flying the P-51, P-47, and Spitfire. This disparity in experience created a lethal feedback loop. A raw German pilot had virtually no chance against an experienced Mustang pilot who had been flying deep penetration missions for months. The veteran Allied pilots were surviving, gaining more combat hours, and further widening the gap in skill. The consequence was predictable. New German pilots were lost almost immediately, often on their first or second sortie, resulting in a staggering wastage of both aircraft and men. Therefore, the collapse of the fighter corps forced the German High Command into a series of increasingly desperate, often irrational tactical shifts. One such shift was the abandonment of the defense-in-depth doctrine itself. As Allied bomber formations were escorted all the way to their targets, the Luftwaffe was forced to move fighters and anti-aircraft defenses forward, attempting to intercept the bomber streams closer to the coasts to prevent them from hitting the inner sanctums of the Reich. This only served to play into the hands of the waiting Allied fighter squadrons, who were now closer to their home bases and could engage with maximum fuel and combat readiness. The psychological devastation manifested in the adoption of ramming tactics, the use of specialized units like the Sonderkommando Elbe. These pilots, often barely trained, were instructed to physically ram the Allied bombers, sacrificing their lives to take down a single B-17 or B-24.
No professional, confident fighting force resorts to state-sponsored suicide missions unless every other rational means of defense has failed. This action was a public admission by the German High Command that they could no longer rely on the skill of their pilots or the superiority of their aircraft to defeat the bombing campaign. But the most demoralizing factor was the introduction of the jet fighter, the Me-262. While the Me-262 was a technological marvel, vastly faster than any Allied propeller aircraft, its deployment was tragically flawed, thanks in part to Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber and by the strategic brilliance of the P-51. The Allied long-range fighter didn't need to be able to catch the Me-262 in the air. It only needed to destroy it on the ground or during its most vulnerable phases of flight. The Me-262 was notoriously slow and vulnerable during takeoff and landing, so the P-51 squadrons began flying combat air patrols over the German jet airfields like an airborne gauntlet. The airfields around places like Lechfeld and Rhine became slaughterhouses for the German jets. This tactic neutralized the most advanced weapon the Luftwaffe possessed, proving that superior range and persistence beat superior speed. The German fighter pilots, facing this constant, overwhelming reality, began to suffer from what was known as Mustang fatigue. They were overworked, undertrained, constantly flying inferior numbers, and permanently exposed to the risk of being shot down by an enemy they could not evade. The veteran aces, who were the moral and instructional backbone of the force, were dwindling to zero. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was effectively combat ineffective, reserved only for token resistance and desperate last-ditch efforts. The end of fighter supremacy was not a single event, it was a slow, agonizing disintegration. It led directly to the Allies achieving total air superiority by 1945. This allowed the Allied tactical air forces to operate with impunity, directly supporting ground troops. This is the ultimate purple payoff for the strategic bombing campaign. Without fear of interception, Allied fighter-bombers, including the P-51, could perform train-busting and cab-rank missions, systematically destroying German transport infrastructure, fuel depots, and troop movements. German soldiers, now under continuous daylight attack from the air, without any Luftwaffe cover, lost faith in their leadership's ability to protect them, accelerating the collapse of the Wehrmacht's fighting spirit on all fronts. The P-51, with its long legs and powerful Merlin heart, was the single greatest factor in turning the sky into a relentless meat grinder for the German fighter arm. The final chapter of this history lies in the surprising post-war lessons that this piston engine wonder passed on to the jet age. It is a peculiar twist of fate that the very fighter that brought the piston engine to its highest form, the P-51 Mustang, became the unwitting professor for the next generation of jet fighters. The war ended with the Me-262 and Gloucester Meteor pointing towards the future, yet it was the long-range philosophy established by the Mustang that truly dictated how that future would be fought. Speed was king, and range was an afterthought. The first generation of jet fighters, born directly out of the technology that Germany was racing to deploy, were incredibly fast, but they had the aerodynamic efficiency of a flying brick and the fuel consumption of a small power station. They were fast, but they couldn't go anywhere. The great irony is that the men who had flown the P-51s and the B-17s were the ones who became the core planners for the new U.S. Air Force. They understood that speed without distance was a tactical curiosity, not a strategic weapon. They learned this the hard way during the deep penetration missions. The target, whether industrial or strategic, was worthless if you couldn't stay on station long enough to protect it. Early jets, like the American F-80 Shooting Star, had an initial design range that was shockingly short.
For instance, the Me-262's maximum effective range was barely 650 miles, and its operational radius was far less. The early designers saw the jet as a short-range point defense interceptor. The pilots and commanders, however, demanded the P-51's legs.
The most critical lesson the P-51 taught the jet age was the importance of the laminar flow wing and aerodynamic efficiency over pure thrust. The P-51 excelled not because its Rolls-Royce engine was overpowered, but because its airframe was so clean and low drag. Early jet engine designers, focused on simply making the engine bigger, were neglecting the crucial fact that every pound of fuel saved meant another minute of combat time. This led directly to a strategic design requirement that became mandatory for all subsequent American fighters. The P-51's drop tank philosophy must be adapted to the jet age. These early American jets were designed with hardpoints capable of carrying massive wingtip or underwing fuel tanks, a direct acknowledgement that the jet's thirsty engine needed the disposable, high-capacity range extension pioneered by the piston Mustang. The P-51's influence truly crystallized just a few years later during the Korean War. The F-86 Sabre, facing off against the Soviet MiG-15, was built under the ethos of the Mustang. The MiG-15 was a rocket of a plane, faster and with a better rate of climb than the Sabre. Yet in the decisive engagements over MiG Alley, the Sabre had a critical advantage inherited from the P-51: loiter time and pilot ergonomics. The Sabre, with its external tanks, could stay on station longer, patrol the patrol line, and wait for the MiGs to become low on fuel. But the transfer of knowledge wasn't just about fuel, it was about the air combat doctrine. The P-51 had perfected the role of the long-range escort hunter. The pilots who flew the Sabre, many of them World War II veterans, carried the Mustang's aggressive, high-energy attack philosophy into the jet cockpit. They understood that the goal was not necessarily to shoot down the bomber, but to destroy the enemy fighter force. This strategic continuity, from the deep penetration of 1944 to the MiG Alley patrols of 1951, is the Mustang's most powerful legacy. The final and perhaps most overlooked lesson the Mustang delivered was on maintainability and mass production. The P-51 was rugged, relatively easy to service in the field, and could be mass-produced in staggering numbers by companies like North American Aviation. The German jet program, by contrast, was highly complex, requiring specialized tooling and materials, making its aircraft difficult to produce and maintain. The post-war U.S. aviation industry adopted the Mustang's philosophy. Simplicity, reliability, and mass manufacturability must be designed into the aircraft from day one, lessons that became the backbone of the entire military-industrial complex. The P-51 Mustang was not merely a stepping stone, it was the intellectual anchor for modern air warfare. It proved that in strategic combat, endurance is the precondition for dominance. Hitler underestimated the ability of a fighter to travel 2,000 miles. Post-war designers, thanks to the Mustang, never made that mistake again. The air war over Europe proved definitively that the strategic value of an aircraft is not measured in its top speed, but in how long it can hold its place in the fight. The concluding section must summarize this entire arc, from the engine swap to the fall of the Luftwaffe, and reflect on the personal, human cost of this strategic victory, fitting for our audience of knowledgeable, reflective peers. We have traced the journey of the P-51 Mustang from an overlooked airframe to the undisputed king of the skies, driven by the ingenious heart of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. We have analyzed the strategic blunders of the German High Command and the profound psychological collapse of the Luftwaffe. Now, as we conclude this story, the focus must shift from the machine and the strategy to the human element, the men who flew those miles, and the enduring legacy of the war won 30,000 feet above the Ruhr. The green setup here is to move beyond the technical specifications and ask what this strategic victory truly meant for the men on both sides. This is where the story shifts from military analysis to human empathy, which resonates deeply with a mature audience. For the Allied bomber crews, the Mustang's arrival was nothing short of a miracle. Before, the moment the P-47s turned back was the moment they began to write their final letters home. The sky became hostile, a gauntlet of flak and cannon shells. After the P-51, that psychological dread lifted. Major General Ira Aker, the commander who had championed the daylight bombing campaign, noted that the drop in bomber losses directly correlated with an immeasurable rise in confidence. Pilots and navigators, previously facing near-suicidal odds, now had a realistic chance of surviving their 25-mission tour. The Mustangs provided not just physical protection, but a vast, continuous blanket of psychological security. The bombers became the bait, and the Mustangs became the trap, using the bomber formations as magnets to draw the German fighters into a fight on Allied terms. Think for a moment about the simple, profound act of the P-51 pilot. They were flying missions of 6, 7, even 8 hours. Pinned inside a cramped cockpit, facing extreme temperatures, either freezing or sweltering, they flew an odyssey across enemy territory, relying entirely on the engineering mastery of that British-American engine and the fuel stored in those 2 external tanks. These missions were not series of short sprints, they were feats of raw, protracted endurance. This brings us to the unspoken legacy of the men. The Mustang's long range required a level of concentration and physical toughness rarely demanded of fighter pilots before. Flying for 8 hours, then entering a high-G dogfight, and finally navigating back across the channel was a crucible. The pilots of the P-51, men like Chuck Yeager and Don Gentile, were not just aces, they were airborne marathon runners, fusing the aggressive spirit of the dogfighter with the unwavering persistence of the bomber pilot. Therefore, the final, deep legacy of the Mustang is that it was the ultimate strategic force multiplier. It didn't just win the air war, it accelerated the end of the ground war. The war won at 30,000 feet directly determined the fate of the men fighting in the hedgerows and trenches below. With the Luftwaffe effectively eliminated by the Mustang's deep penetration, the Allied ground forces achieved overwhelming tactical air support.
The German army could not move troops, fuel, or ammunition by daylight without being subjected to continuous strafing and bombing attacks from the now dominant Allied fighter bombers. General George S. Patton, a commander who understood logistics, often credited the air superiority provided by fighters like the Mustang as the single most critical factor in his Third Army's rapid advance across France. The war of attrition the Luftwaffe had hoped to wage against the bombers was ultimately waged against the German ground transportation system by the Mustang. But the story isn't complete without recognizing the price paid by the enemy. The disintegration of the Luftwaffe was a tragedy of command and a catastrophe for the young men forced into the cockpits of their outdated aircraft. For the German pilot in 1945, the sight of a silver P-51 was a death sentence. The psychological defeat was so complete that near the end of the war, many German airfields reported high rates of aircraft sabotage and pilot desertion, a profound indication that the will to fight had been broken by the seemingly endless presence of the long-range escort. The final, enduring takeaway is the sheer brilliance of the simplicity that defeated complexity. Hitler's focus on exotic jets and specialist weapons was undone by 2 simple concepts: range and reliability. The P-51 was a classic, balanced piston-engine aircraft that could simply fly farther and fight longer than anything else.
Today, as we look back at the greatest generation and the conflicts they faced, the P-51 Mustang stands as a monument to engineering collaboration and battlefield adaptation. It proved that a humble piston engine, given the necessary range and married to a superior airframe, could rewrite the entire strategic map of a world war. It guaranteed the survival of the bomber crews, strangled the German logistical system, and crushed the spirit of the enemy air force. The men who flew the miles are gone, or they are our fathers and grandfathers now. But the legacy of their long, lonely patrols at 30,000 feet, that final successful campaign to win the war in the air, is secure. The men who flew those long-haul missions secured air superiority not just for themselves, but for every soldier on the ground who benefited from an empty sky. It's a legacy of endurance and ingenuity that we should never forget. If you have a personal connection to this history, perhaps you or someone you know served in the air war over Europe, I'd be honored if you shared your story in the comments. Hearing from you is what truly brings this history alive. Until the next broadcast, keep the past close and remember the miles flown by those who made the difference.